Hello, good morning, and thank you very much for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to hearing all the presentations today. As technological innovations enter heritage and museum ecologies, it can be tempting and perhaps easy sometimes to get distracted by a focus on the latest technology, the latest tool that we can experiment with and we can adopt. And likewise, these expressions of technolove, as we could call them, can be accompanied by forms of technophobia just as strong. So to challenge this tendency in this talk, I would like to broaden the perspective and discuss together on a conceptual level whether and how citizens and memory organizations, particularly museums, can develop democratic digital heritage ecosystems in the age of big data. And I hope you will excuse a bit of a focus on heritage museums that showcase the past in many different aspects and forms. It's a legacy of my background as an archaeologist. And I hope to contribute through this presentation to what has been an increasingly lively discussion on the social activist role of museums, a discussion that has led to the new definition of museums published by ICOM in 2022, a definition that emphasizes the nature of museums as inclusive spaces committed to foster diversity and sustainability. This discussion has been developing over the last couple of decades through a series of important contributions in the field of museology, and you see some here in the slide. Sharon McDonald's work on the representation of diversity in museums as the negotiation and coexistence of difference. Richard Sandel's reflections on museums as means of inclusivity and social justice. Elaine Gurian's writing on the need for museums to be spaces open to people with different and opposite views. Or Areti Galani and colleagues' research on the role of digital museum practices to foster dialogue and democracy in Europe. So in what follows, I will first introduce the concept of cultural democracy and how it differs from democratization, both equally important. Then I will consider how different uses of crowdsourcing, social media, and generative AI can be facilitating or hindering cultural democracy. And finally, I will end with some concluding thoughts on the ways in which museums can promote cultural democracy through the transformation and redistribution of data practices of heritage making. Far from being just things, objects, heritage is a powerful carrier of identities and values. And creating heritage involves interacting with objects, places, traditions from the past, and assigning cultural and social meanings to these aspects of the past today. Processes of heritage making are therefore both guided by and working to enact specific ideas of self and other, of communality, connectedness, and groupness. As such, they have profound societal relevance, and it is crucial that they are equitable and viable for different citizens in a culturally democratic society. The notion of cultural democracy relates to the capability that citizens have to produce and express their heritage via methods that ensure exchange and cooperation. As a concept, cultural democracy does not focus on broadening the availability of existing heritage resources, but on people's agency to generate new ones with which they identify. Cultural democracy is therefore different from the democratization of culture, which instead prioritizes the accessibility of heritage and associated narratives that are already established by museums, by archives, and historic sites. A recent example is the 2019 EU Declaration on the Cooperation of Advancing Digitization of Cultural Heritage, which builds on previous recommendations and really focuses on the democratization of culture. And democratizing culture, broadening access, is certainly a very important agenda. But my point is that arguably it's not one to be pursued in isolation, not the only one to be pursued. Why? Because only working to intensify the readiness and use of existing culture through digitization can be problematic for two reasons sometimes. The first is that this approach may be underpinned by a deficit model perspective, whereby not accessing and not engaging with existing resources is seen as necessarily denoting a lack of cultural activity. And second, solely striving to disseminate material and immaterial aspects of the past that have already been recognized as heritage may lead to further marginalize the pasts that do not feature in the official record or that are less represented in that record. And in doing so, it may also lead to further marginalize the citizens who feel connected to such invisible or underrepresented pasts. Marking a shift from exclusively looking at the democratization approach that I described, and again I would like to emphasize, which is also very important, the 2021 Porto Santo Charter, Culture and the Promotion of Democracy towards a European cultural citizenship, acknowledges the pressing need to address cultural democracy in order to build a more cohesive European society. And in particular, the Charter advocates for the development of pathways to cultural democracy that broaden cultural production. It also specifically emphasizes the urgency of studying digital practices of cultural production that can be implemented by a diverse array of people across Europe. I would argue that such studies should take a system approach and concentrate on understanding how cultural democracy can be promoted within digital heritage ecosystems. These are systems where contemporary human, non-human actors, people, algorithms, web platforms co-interact with objects, places, and traditions from the past through big data practices. In the last 20 years, heritage making has been transformed by an unprecedented proliferation of data. And this so-called big data has emerged from practices that include the use of networked web infrastructures to communicate and collaborate, more widespread mass digitization and cataloging of artifacts or monuments, large-scale surveys and citizen science, crowdsourcing. Such big data practices are reshaping digital heritage ecosystems by changing the methods and relations through which various combinations of technical and social actors are making heritage today. At a time of increasingly interconnected and converging web infrastructures and big data that are transforming digital ecosystems, a growing number of people have opportunities to express their own culture and identities. And importantly, this can also be achieved through networking and cooperation with fellow citizens and with museums, heritage organizations. However, these processes of digitally enabled cultural capability are not always equitable. They're neither equally viable for all citizens, nor do they necessarily lead to building a socially inclusive society. And in what follows, I will discuss how cultural democracy is enacted in digital heritage ecosystems by focusing on the big data methods of social media-based crowdsourcing and engagement, generative AI applied to the development and showcasing of museum interpretation. I will consider the consequences of the application of these methods under different conditions on the plurality of two things. First, the social actors involved in heritage making and their relations. Second, the cultural representations projected by the heritage that is celebrated in this way. Hoskins writes that in the digital age, memory has become pervasive, accessible, disposable, distributed, promiscuous, and it is therefore no longer dependent on traditional forms of the archive or the archivist. Is it true? Perhaps not quite. And as we've heard in the opening speeches, we have lingering the issues and dangers of disinformation and misinformation online. This is clearly not always and entirely the case. However, and despite the promises of social media or crowdsourcing, heritage making is still importantly drawing on expertise, technical know-how, and their decision-making processes. However, there is some important truth also behind aspects of Hoskins' words. Let's think, for instance, of the grassroots museums that have emerged around the world from the interests of specific groups who felt their heritage was not present in existing collections or was represented partially or differently from how they would have liked it to see. An example among others that are possible is the Women of Kazakhstan Virtual Museum project. This is a project set up entirely on Instagram. Although gender policies in Kazakhstan do not yet include the creation of women's historical places, the NGO Women of Kazakhstan developed the first and only online platform to present the story of Kazakhstani women past and present. And the NGO chose to use Instagram for this virtual museum because of Instagram's high level of growth among young audiences. It was indeed a successful choice. And in early July 2020, the Women of Kazakhstan Instagram account already had over 50,000 followers. 84% women, 86% between 18 and 44 years of age, 78% located in Kazakhstan. And as we read in the publication that I'm showing in the slide dedicated to this virtual museum, whereas existing museums in Kazakhstan create and exhibit collections under direct government mandate, this project operates independently and for this reason is able to adapt and modify its public exhibitions and online space quite flexibly. In addition, the project does not exclusively center on women's achievements, but also covers topics that are not quite as showcased in the official record, such as women's rights, feminism, domestic violence, and many more. This self-proclaimed virtual museum is effectively a response to a representation of women perceived as quite fixed and as not addressing key themes of interest to citizens. Another example is that of grassroots communities creating social media environments to interpret and promote dialogue about built heritage that is not legally protected in Poland at the moment. They use a Facebook page called Here It Was, Here It Stood, that today counts over 400,000 followers. They also used Instagram, other social media, and a bespoke website to co-produce maps and digital collections of buildings that are in a state of decay or have already been destroyed. And these bottom-up initiatives have provided an activist response to what was perceived as being the limited care manifested by heritage management bodies in this case. Crucially, these initiatives have also triggered the response of memory organizations, such as the Museum of Architecture in Wrocław, which is committed to restoring hostile official narratives of Soviet heritage through digital engagement. And indeed, this has become a virtuous example of active listening of grassroots virtual museums by established museum institutions. It is arguably one of the most effective ways of enabling cultural democracy, as the expanded capability of citizens to define and interpret the heritage they value with the help and support of museums. In other words, the virtual is real and is generative. It triggers new processes of museum curation. And this is to use the words used by Robin Lee, who draws on the work of the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, to describe the relationships, fruitful relationships between online and offline forms of collecting in the Kanupahanska Luger's Mirror Shields project. In other cases, museums' co-production with citizens on the ground was planned through forms of crowd collecting that have ranged widely in type and focus. Some have been very political. They've consisted, for example, in crowdsourcing via social media, the collection of materials relating to protests, such as the 300-plus women's marches that occurred in 2017, or the community activism against the Dakota Access Pipeline in the US, so a kind of environmental activism. And this form of crowd collecting, contemporary issue collecting, often happening while the protests were still ongoing, has proved a powerful way of acquiring social history materials in a timely manner and to give exhibitions a unique sense of immediacy. In contrast, other instances of crowd collecting were not at all as activist and socially engaged, but focused particularly on the personal and familiar experiences of citizens. This is the example that you see in the slide, the Getty Museum's social media crowdsourcing of people's reenactments of their favorite artworks during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this to keep the engagement going at a time when museums were shut and museum engagement could not happen in the spaces where it used to happen. Finally and importantly, transformations in heritage making sparked by social media practices have changed ideas of locality and placemaking, creating opportunities for connecting comparable experiences developed in potentially distant geographic areas. There are increasing examples of websites and hashtags used to create these transnational and transcultural networks of mnemonic entanglements, as Lieberman calls them. For example, Twitter X hashtags like decolonize this place have been important visual signals through which transnational and, as the museology Heidi Geismar calls them, unruly collections of heritage values can be assembled. However, even if big data practices have augmented cultural democracy by allowing more diverse groups to participate in the selection and digitalization of heritage, they may still result in exclusion and inequalities. It's important to remember this. And these exclusion, these inequalities occur when big data practices have resulted in the perspectives of some being ultimately more influential online, and if heritage representations are not respectful of diversity, understood as the coexistence of difference, but rather used to frame antagonistic ideas of the other. An unfair cultural democracy can also be a result of the specific ways in which web platforms are built, their algorithms, their technical functioning, and how they co-interact with people, with users. Going back to the example of those unruly collections that I mentioned, brought together by hashtags on social media, research has shown that these collections can really empower and be very useful for vulnerable individuals understood as voices traditionally less represented. However, the hypervisibility and hypervelocity of social networking sites have also exposed these very same constituencies to abuse and may effectively turn the expression of their cultural capability online into opportunities for attack, thus further undermining their position and their role in society. So the question remains, what can museums do with these forms of collecting from below to guarantee fair cultural democracy in practice? Acknowledge, I would argue, assess, evaluate, to understand what they are, if they are indeed or not unlocking this plurality that I was talking about, and if so, engage, acquire, augment, by which I mean enhance, improve, support, and showcase. And I will now turn to consider briefly the intersections of cultural democracy and generative AI, which is perhaps the latest magnet attracting this techno-love and technophobia in the world of heritage and museums, as in many other professional fields, and rightly so. AI has indeed been around for quite a while now, but as most of you, I'm sure, will know, generative AI is a quite new form of artificial intelligence. And what is also new is that it's so publicly available and has been for the last couple of years. Generative AI systems produce textual, visual, audiovisual, or audio outputs based on users' requests. And responses are produced based on probabilities of certain combinations of words, images, and sound to be the appropriate response to a given prompt. So we're talking of predictions made thanks to large language models in the case of text-based generative AI. Large language models that are trained on huge quantity of data. Applications of generative AI within heritage and museums ecologies are growing very rapidly, especially to assist with the development, visualization, and showcasing of interpretations. And let's consider the example of chatbots. Szerepére and Maria Economou, among others, have researched and discussed the powerful nature of chatbots. Thank you. The powerful nature of chatbots as forms of digital storytelling, able to foster empathy for people living in the past. And through this process, connections with themes and ways of being that could have otherwise felt distant and foreign. So generative AI can make visitors' interactions with these chatbots come to life more strongly and in ways that are better tailored to their interests, to the interests of different individuals. However, aspects to consider as regards those involved in making interpretations through generative AI and the outputs of generative AI in relation to the notion of cultural democracy is something we should reflect on. Generative AI is effectively a mirror. Shannon Valor, a prominent philosopher of technology, says that when we use generative AI, we often act like Narcissus of Greek mythology. Narcissus sees himself reflected in the water and thinks he's seeing something other than himself and really striking. And this is because generative AI systems produce the output that is most likely to be an accurate response to our prompt based on that training data that exists because we produced it. It is therefore unsurprising that has shown that, for example, this really prominent and important paper, text generated by the LLM ChatGPT-3 reflects human biases when producing content. So it generates content that is a gender stereotype consistent, is social, tends to be negative in terms of sentiment, threat-related, use of threatening language, and biologically counterintuitive. These are features that appear most likely also in that training data that sort of fuels and makes the ChatGPT-3, in this case, work. Researchers have documented also a bias towards interpretation that, from a political point of view, privilege a capitalist worldview. But at the same time, there is research showing that there tends to be a bias towards left-wing ideologies in responses to prompts made to ChatGPT-3. I've examined bias in interpretation and the ways in which diversity in generative AI outputs, or the lack of this diversity, can in a way hinder cultural democracy, or is something that we should take into account when using generative AI, at least in this sort of large language model format. Something else to think about is the digital skills and access of those interrogating these generative AI systems. So if we're thinking of museum visitors, our users, the language that they use, which will influence, together with their prompting style, the answers that they will get. So if we think of Usenet to power interpretations in museum spaces, these are all considerations that are really important to take into account. And coming to the conclusions, because I'm conscious of time, by reflecting on the landscape that I've rapidly surveyed, I believe that in an increasingly complex and interconnected digital heritage ecosystem, the focus of museums when navigating technological change could be first and foremost on understanding how to relate to citizens in order to enhance cultural democracy. And there is no silver bullet to understand how this can be done, if not that of defining and applying a robust theoretical and methodological framework to assess on a case-by-case basis the digital innovation strategies that we embrace as professionals, and whether or not and how they're there to enable the plurality of those who can participate in the discussions of what to collect and how, and of the representations that these collections put forward. Thank you very much for listening.